There's no place like the Cube.
Hey, I'm Darren.
And I'm Esther, and this is Second Sunday, a podcast about Black queer people finding, keeping, and sometimes losing faith.
I think the issue that the Black church has today is that it won't embrace or recognize its own queerness. But what if we didn't reject queerness? In fact, what if our embrace of queerness is actually the place where we find our liberation? What if queerness is our salvation?
Have you even heard of that phrase, queering the church, before?
Yes, from my light knowledge of what it means to take a queer look at the church, it means like to challenge some of the assumptions that we make and some of the ways that we talk, which in turn like magnifies the marginalization of already marginalized groups of people.
It's this idea of, in the same way that queer got applied to LGBTQ plus people because of the unusualness, it's also this opportunity for us to say the church is inherently unusual. And if that's true, then what do we need to think about differently?
Maybe it's because I've spent so many years having to argue and defend myself against people who are already so entrenched in their own language and buzzwords and all of these things. But from a marketing perspective, it doesn't feel like the most like door opening thing to me to be like, the queerness is going to be the salvation. It just feels like it sets off alarm bells. Mind you, I'm not going to argue with people anyway, so y'all can do what y'all want and say whatever you want to those people. Me personally, I wouldn't approach the strategic opening of the conversation like that if we're truly talking about addressing the institutions that we're talking about, because just the wording is like, I'm just not like a shock jock.
Yeah, and we know that just saying those words causes the hairs to rise up on people's arms. Somebody blushed. It's a mother clutching her pearls right now. But there is something really powerful that Don is going to unpack for us today. So let's talk about it. Don Abram is the founder and executive director of Pride in the Pews. His organization is equipping Black churches to care for the holistic health of Black LGBTQ plus communities, with a special focus on how religion impacts our overall wellness. He's also a queer theologian, and every time he speaks, it feels like an old school Sunday morning sermon. There's a lot to unpack here, and the saints ain't ready for this.
But we gonna talk about it anyway.
I grew up in a hand-clapping, toe-tapping Black church on the south side of Chicago, and my Jamaican patois-speaking grandmother would drag me to church every single Sunday. So my mother raised me. However, my mother was not a churchgoer, but she was very much so giving my grandmother free rein to drag us to church. And it was often at the behest of my refusal. I'm not interested in going. Actually, I can't go because I don't have matching socks. One day it was socks, another day it was gloves, another day it was anything that I could come up with. But I did that all to no avail, and she would drag me anyway. And I really began to get involved. I played the bass guitar. I was in the choir. I moved from the usher board to the deacon board. I mean, I was fully engrossed in the life of the church. And I really received my call to preach at the age of 14. So I moved from the usher board to the deacon board to the choir stand to the bass guitar. And eventually I made my way to the pulpit. One unsuspecting winter day, I was on the south side of Chicago, which is where I lived. And I was coming back home from school. It was freezing cold. And before I even took off my clothes, I sat on my bed and I turned on the heater because I wanted to get warm. And while I was getting warm, I ended up drifting asleep. And in that sleep, I awoke in a dream. And in that dream, I was not in human form, but in celestial form. And I found myself in my home sanctuary. And the congregants cannot see me. And then I make my way into the sanctuary. And when I do, I notice that there's a service happening. And it's the regular Sunday, just like the Sunday my grandmother would take me to. Folks are shouting and praising God exuberantly, and I'm just watching. And I began to walk down the center aisle, and I see this figure. I presume that it's my pastor, Pastor Frederick E. Wilson Sr. And of course, this is how the congregation responds to him. I can't really see the figure. It's distorted. It's not made out. And as I walk closer, I began to see that figure more clearly. And eventually I discovered that that figure was actually me. I awoke from the dream and I refused to believe that it ever happened. This was in some ways my worst nightmare. I mean, I grew up with my dad. He didn't live with me, but he was very present in my life. He was a pastor. I would go visit him every single summer. We would be the pastor's kids. And I saw everything that he went through. I saw the pressure and the toll that preaching and pastoring takes on you. And I said, I do not want this life. I am not interested in this trajectory. And I don't want this to be my life story. And so I tucked that dream away. I never voiced it to anyone, but it was recurring. It just kept coming back and kept coming back and kept coming back. And then eventually I said, okay, I think I need someone to help me interpret this. Like, I don't think it means what it means. So it obviously means something else. Right. I end up actually talking to my grandmother and says, Grandma, I had this dream. I don't really know what it's about. Can you tell me? Like, you're real close to God and you go to Bible study, you go to church every Sunday. Can you tell me what it is? And my grandmother said, well, Don, I can't tell you what it means because God gave it to you. Only you can decide and interpret what that means. And I said, well, that doesn't help me. And eventually I decide that, yeah, I think God is calling me to preach. And so one Sunday, I recall vividly, I knocked on the pastor's door very sheepishly, and he said, come on in. And his voice was booming. I walk into his office and said, I think I have something to tell you. And he says, okay, of course, have a seat. And I said, well, I think I've been called to preach. And he says, okay. And he says, are you sure about this? I said, I am. He says, how do you know? And I said, well, here's the dream. And he says, okay. And he says, I want you to know that if you decide to do this, there's no going back. You will ring a clock that you can never unring. We will tell the people, you will preach your first sermon, and you will be in ministry. After telling you that, have you still been called? I said, yes, I believe I have been. And a month later, I was up preaching my first sermon. And during that sermon, it dawned on me that the dream I had was a thing that was happening.
Wow. It's interesting that this is yet another person that's like very into church life and very dedicated to that, and then has this dream that is like, you need to serve in this way. And they're kind of rejecting it at first. Like, this is a lot, because it is a lot.
Yeah. And we see over and over again, we keep hearing the stories that people share in this podcast, and they talk about the dreams that they have. And to me, it is so biblical, right? Everybody from Joseph and Jacob to the wise men and King Solomon, they all heard from God in dreams, and the course of their lives were changed as a result. And in the first time, or, right away as he begins his preaching career, to have that show up, that's very powerful to me. Don was out there preaching up a storm. He was inspiring folks everywhere he went.
My calendar is full. I am preaching youth revivals. I'm preaching youth days. I am being flown out across the country. My bank account is going up. My itinerary is going up. My closet full of three-piece suits is being expanded. I mean, every now and then there's a child preacher that goes viral on like TikTok or Instagram. And that was me at 14, preaching to 200, 300, 400 persons congregations. And it was exhilarating, and it was fun, and it was so fulfilling. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, to have someone my mom's age coming up to me after a sermon saying, you spoke to exactly what I've been dealing with, or to have someone my age say, wow, like I didn't know that you could connect with God in that way. And you gave me permission to explore my spirituality. I mean, at 14, this is what I'm hearing, that the thing that God has given me is blessing the lives of so many across lines of difference. I just knew I was on the path that I was supposed to be on. I didn't need confirmation from anyone at that point. I knew that God was speaking through me and using me to encourage and uplift folks.
It's 2011 and the Arab Spring is raging. A lesbian activist in Syria starts a blog. She names it Gay Girl in Damascus.
Am I crazy? Maybe.
As her profile grows, so does the danger.
The object of the email was, please read this while sitting down.
It's like a genie came out of the bottle and you can't put it back.
Gay Girl Gone. Available now.
Hey friends, we're having a live event with PRX.
And we want you to join us virtually.
The PRX Big Questions Project presents
Making It, a night of big questions.
It's Tuesday, June 11th at 7 p.m. Eastern.
Click the link in the show notes to register today.
And so the dream that Don had was more accurate than he ever could have imagined, but he was also deeply conflicted.
Yeah, so part of the theology I was raised in suggests that you are closer to the divine the more you deny your humanity. Your divinity can only increase when your humanity decreases. And so we were taught to demonize and otherize the flesh. That comes in the form of desires. Oh, I think this person is really cute. I'd like to spend more time with them. I'd like to explore my sexuality with them. No, that's the flesh. And so there are ways in which my faith taught me to deny what it means to be human. Of course, as I came into my queerness and lived into the truth of my sexuality, I realized that God was big enough and capacious enough to hold my dynamism. But I didn't know that at the time. And I would like to say that that journey really began in the church. For some strange reason, I gave myself permission to explore my sexuality in the church. I began to explore my sexuality with another young man, same age as me, in places like the bathroom and the Sunday school classroom and the pastor's office and the first lady's office. And we began to just give each other permission to be queer. To explore, to be curious. We are simply horny teenagers that are trying to figure out what it means to be sexualized beings. But it wasn't until I got into divinity school and began to explore my past and my history that I realized that that was the beginning of my own spiritual exploration without incarceration. And what I mean by that is that's the first place where I began to connect with the divine without shame and without fear. That was the place in exploring my body with this young man in that bathroom where I began to understand what a God who was big enough to hold my complex identities and lived experience looked like. Because that God met me in the bathroom. That God reassured me and affirmed for me that living into the fullness of this human expression was a divine thing. It was not something to be ashamed of. It was not something I needed to stay away from. It wasn't something I needed to rid myself of. But in living into that truth, living into that thing, I met the divine. Placing my hands on his face, placing my hands on his arms, his hands caressing my body, it gave me a sense of divine freedom. It introduced me to agape love, unconditional love. You need to be nothing else. You need to become nothing else. As you are loved. You are desired. You are wanted. And so while the church may have seen that as a purely fleshly and carnal endeavor, I saw it as a deeply spiritual one.
For so many queer folks, exploration of typical teenage sexuality came with a huge question. What if someone found out? And many of us intuitively knew that someone finding out would have devastating consequences. Fortunately for Don, his experiences were never brought to light. During high school, his classmates would call him preacher, and he loved it. He lived into it, and he took his call very seriously. Throughout college, he became even more curious about the biblical text and wanted to dig deeper. So he decided to continue his theological studies at Harvard Divinity School, where he blossomed into a more courageous version of himself.
I grew up Donald Abram. That was the way my family saw me and knew me, and that was my dad's name, Donald. I was just little Donald, Donald Jr. And when I began to live into my identity, I was just like, this doesn't feel like it's mine. Donald is not who I am. Donald is everyone else's version of me. That's not me. Donald is the preacher who travels around. Donald is the closeted queer man. Donald is the one who's conforming to everyone else's expectations. Donald is the one who says no to alcohol. Donald is the one who says no to liberating sexual experiences. Donald is the one who says, I cannot live into the truth of who I am because I want to spare my community. That's Donald. But that's not me. And so when I got to divinity school, I said, I'm not Donald. I'm Don. Don is who I am. Don is free. Don is not interested or concerned with how other folk view or see his truth. Don is interested in carrying out his call in the world with all of who he is, not just parts of who he is. And so that name change really was the start of me coming out. Theologically, in terms of my sexuality, that was the start of it. So at that point, I am out at Harvard Divinity School. I'm singing Diana Ross, I'm coming out. I have the language, right? I am over here riddling off text and scripture. I am providing socio-historical context. I am talking about exegesis and exegetical interpretation. I mean, I'm doing the things, okay? And so no one wants to argue with me now. Right? Like no one really wants to be in conversation with me about that queer thing because you won't really be able to weaponize the text against me. And so folk knew that they didn't want to argue with me on those grounds. Anyone who was introduced to me after that point, it was introduced to me as Don, the Black queer preacher.
Being a Black queer man also comes with a lot of expectations around masculinity and femininity. Our families and our churches sometimes have a lot to say about how we should and shouldn't show up in the world.
I will name that femininity was not fundamentally rejected by my church. Particularly effeminate men were not fundamentally rejected by my church. Often one's femininity, right, muted femininity, but nevertheless femininity, was seen as the sort of affect of a respectable young man. He wasn't as rough, he wasn't as thuggish, right? He was respectable and spoke well and was kind to women, right? And so in many ways, the church held space for my alternative form of masculinity. And they were comfortable with the forms of femininity that I expressed, in large part because of, I think, the church's subscription to respectability politics, but also because I was preaching. I was delivering the word. And so you couple those two things together, like me living into my truth was permissible. And so you can be a bit more effeminate. That's okay, because it signals that you are growing up as a nice young man. But growing up in the neighborhood is a different story. Living into that sort of femininity leads to castigation and ridicule and rejection and constant attempts to harden you up because you're too soft. And so there are instances where men on the block would physically assault me in the service of toughening me up. There were moments where my brother would physically assault me, all right, in service of toughening me up, so that if anything ever happened in the street, you know how to get that animal out of you so that you can fight back, so that you can push back. I need to develop this aggressiveness. And so my pleas to be able to breathe were not stronger than his desire to make me a man. That was something that I constantly felt because I never felt safe. As a way to avoid the persecution and ridicule that came with my rejection of toxic masculinity and manhood, I just tried to be quiet, tried to make myself small, because maybe if they don't see me, they won't hurt me. That was the ethos that I operated within, which is part of the reason why I didn't want to preach. But I knew that there would be increased scrutiny and eyes on me, right, in ways that I didn't really want, because being quiet kept me safe. So navigating the church and the community as a Black, queer man of faith, of the cloth, was a complicated journey, and one that caused me to constantly shape shift depending on the context I found myself in, but never being able to exhale, because I always thought that at some moment I would be found out.
Want to dive into how technology and Black spirituality intersect? Or confront the challenges new tech is creating? Maybe even catch a vision of hope for the future?
Check out Moral Repair, a Black exploration of tech. A podcast about the innovations that make our world and break our societies.
And how we can all heal just a bit. Available on Spotify, Apple, and wherever you listen to podcasts.
I just never thought of it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Like looking at men who are more effeminate being able to navigate the landscape of the church by utilizing respectability politics as a shield.
Yeah.
It's like almost like turning the subtleties back around on them, right? And in some ways I can relate too, right? And I want to hear how you can relate to this, but I can relate because growing up, I never thought of myself as masculine, and I still don't really. I mean, I just get called sir, so that's not under my control. But in the ways that we were raised, it was like, cover up, do this, do that, don't have sex before marriage. I was like, oh, I can do all of these things.
Okay.
So I'm wondering what this was like from your perspective growing up, because, you know, you got the locks. I don't know if you had a beard back then. You're tall, you're handsome.
So you are tapping on so many things that are especially true for us. Historically speaking, the Black church, one of its strategies for human rights and civil rights and the fight for equality was to conform, to mimic, to imitate the customs of a white European society. Like everything from the style of clothes that we wear to having very neat, coiled, combed, flattened, straightened hair, all these kind of processes were part of us at one point saying the best way to make it into greater society is to fit in, to not stand out. But all of this comes back to this idea that to be good, to be godly, to make it, you have to fit in. And we've repeated that cycle over and over.
It's almost like to be good, you have to be muted.
And for queer folks, it was easy in many ways for some of us, like me, to blend in. I was the kid who people said, oh, is Darren going? Oh, you can go, because I know y'all ain't going to get in no trouble. Meanwhile, I had the shortcuts. But respectability was so first nature. Because just like Don said, I wasn't chasing after the girls. We was having good, thoughtful conversations. You know, I was well-spoken. I fit the bill of who they wanted to be seen in church, and I did not fit into the streets. I had what the churches and schools and the business people wanted. And so I felt that struggle, and I felt that tension. And yeah, muting yourself, becoming less of yourself, doing whatever you can to not be seen or not be noticed, that was totally the way of survival. And so what I love is that Don begins to push back.
I cross my legs in the pulpit, child. I definitely do that. I also offer up dangerous, complicated interpretations of scripture. I make certain claims about David and Jonathan being lovers, right? I make certain claims about Jesus being queer in his ministry. I make certain claims about the ways in which scripture has always affirmed queer folk and have been on the side of the oppressed and the left behind. Those are things that are fundamental to who I am and just the way that I approach ministry and scripture. And so there are ways that I am just disrupting, what it means to be a queer man, and living that out in the world. If we simply identify or describe queerness as sexuality alone, we are missing the benefits and gifts that come with the lens that we're given as queer and trans folks. Because the gifts of our lived experience, the expertise of our lived experience, is not simply in whom we decide to partner with or have sex with. That experience and that truth invites us into imagining the world around us anew. It is divergent. It is otherwise. It is subversive. And that is the way that queer and trans folk live our lives. It is different. It is distinct. It is queered as a verb. And for me, that's actually not very different from the way that the Black church was founded and formed. We were out in the back of plantations, out in hush harbors, in the clearing, creating the otherwise. Because we decided that a white supremacist church which tells us that we are not loved by God as we are does not sit right with us. We knew within ourselves that the weaponization of scripture against our humanity was not our lot in life. We knew that someone telling us we did not have access to the divine because of our Blackness, because of an inherent part of our identity and who we are, was simply not true. And so we decided to queer faith, queer spirituality by going to the hush harbor, by going to those dark wooded places. And we decided to create something new. And that newness is what scholars call the invisible church. But that's what we now know today as the Black church. And so for me, the Black church offering up a pro-Black theology, the Black church seeing God as Black and as affirming Black humanity, that's queer. And so by being introduced to the Black church, born and raised in the Black church, they were raising me in queer theology. They just didn't know it. And I think the issue that the Black church has today is that it won't embrace or recognize its own queerness. But what if we didn't reject queerness? In fact, what if our embrace of queerness is actually the place where we find our liberation?
You know, it makes sense what he's saying about queering the church, because just by the nature of the formation of the Black church, it had to be other than what was established, because we weren't allowed to have access to the established way of doing things. There was always an alternative route to us, which inherently means challenging what you're being told in church.
I love the hope and exhilaration that I get from hearing somebody like Don literally every time he speaks, anytime I see him, it can just be a how are you doing conversation. And Don has a whole word in season and out of season. And yeah, when we think about why we are here, right? Why still be Christian? Why still be in the church? What do I have to give to this place that's been so harmful to me? I think it's an opportunity for us to see a very radical, unusual, inclusive, bold, relevant, amazing, diverse future. And I think that queerness invites us to continue to imagine what's possible, to continue to imagine what the future could look like. When I hear Don give us these questions and give us these calls, as we look at a church that is struggling through the aftermath of a global pandemic, the downturn of attendance in mainline denominations in the US and in Europe, and when we look at the horrible impacts of all the violence and abuses that have happened to people in the church, and ask, is it still worth it? I really do think that on the other side of this, that we, the survivors, the ones who are the outcasts, the ones who, again, like Jesus, would have gotten put out of the temple, that we're the ones who are creating this vibrant and powerful future that the world really hasn't seen the fullness of yet.
The Second Sunday podcast is hosted by Esther and Darren Calhoun. But podcasting is a team sport, so a big thank you to our dream team.
Our producers, Esther Ikoro, Anna DeShawn, and Nichole Hill. Our associate producer, Amber Walker.
Our sound designer, Florence Adams, and our managing producers, Jocelyn Gonzalez and Courtney Florentine.
Our opening theme song is Maya B's original track titled They Don't Know. You should download the full song today.
To learn more about today's guests or the show, visit our show notes on our website, secondsundaypod.com, and on Instagram @secondsundaypod. Second Sunday is a production of The Cube, spelled with a Q, in partnership with the PRX Big Questions Project, which is generously supported by the John Templeton Foundation and produced by PRX Productions.
The Cube is your #1 curated platform to discover the best BIPOC and QTPOC podcasts.
Support this show and more like it by joining the Cube app and follow the Cube across social media @the Cube app.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next episode.